Yeah, thanks, Heather. I tried to go through the projects that Mid-Columbia Fisheries has sponsored that utilize the grant sources that were just discussed. So I have a highlight of 4 of our projects where we can look at the way the funding came together and just talk briefly about some of the challenges with patching funding together like that. Next slide, please. But before we get into it, I just wanted to remind us all that fish need trees. We need trees along the stream, we need trees in the stream. And our focus is frequently on planting for shade, which is critical in our warming climate. But we also need the trees and shrubs to provide overhanging cover to shelter fish. We need the hydraulic roughness on the floodplain that native trees and shrubs provide. And we need the nutrients that come from the leaf litter and debris and the filtration aspect. So those parts are critical to fish habitat. So as a result of that, almost all of our salmon and steelhead restoration projects include riparian planting. And the exception to that comes when we're focused on restoring hydrology, but not making any changes to the existing floodplain surface. So if we're not leaving an expanse of bare soil and we're trying to increase the floodplain inundation, we'll frequently decide to just wait to see how the riparian responds. But except for in that case, planting is almost a key component. So today I wanted to highlight those grants, and I wanted to do that by focusing on these 4 projects. The first is in the lower Yakima River, north of Benton City, but the other 3 are in Ellensburg, where coincidentally I live. Mid-Columbia Fisheries does not just work in Ellensburg, despite what I will present here. We are spread throughout the Yakima, Klickitat, white salmon, and parts of the Wind River Basin. We're part of the Regional Fisheries Enhancement Group network in Washington State, which is 14 independent nonprofit organizations with some dedicated funding from WDFW and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. That RFEG funding is very small, often less than 10% of our annual operating budget, but it is critical to our ability to move projects forward. So I tried to think about how I could make this into an interactive bingo exercise by looking at the funding that comes together on projects, but I'm going to have to work on that for next year. In the meantime, this is an overview of the primary funding sources for the projects I'll highlight today. And I just want to draw your attention again to that RFEG funding. If we did not have the base funding, we would not be able to work with landowners to identify and develop projects, to get them ready for grant proposals, and then to manage those grants. So if we were starting a brand new Friends of the Yakima River organization, we would not be in a position where we'd be able to seek any of the grant funds we discussed today. So the first project, just downstream of Benton City, is located in one of the places where we have cool water inputs to the Yakima River. That's critical in this reach of the river because the very warm temperatures we experience in summer are limiting to the ability for the river to support salmon and steelhead. The landowner at River Mile 25, Bill Mast, got in touch with NRCS to ask how he might improve wood duck and salmon habitat on his property. NRCS referred him to Benton Conservation District and Mid-Columbia Fisheries, and we worked together to develop a project to increase the influence of his disconnected oxbow on the river so that there was a greater cool water input. And because we want that input to make it to the river cool, planting is a really important part of that project. We evaluate all of our projects on their potential to increase salmon habitat resilience to climate change. And so the first screen for this project indicated, yes, cool water refuge is a way to increase resilience to climate change. And so then the next step is to say, all right, well, how do we support this project? And to do that, we look at a few key questions. What is the land ownership? Are there salmon? And are there water quality impairments in the area? So this project is on private agricultural land, it has a key benefit for salmon, and it addresses the temperature water quality limitation in the Yakima River. So could you take a second and put in the chat the top funding sources that come to mind for you for this? I should have given warning that I wanted interaction. Okay, I see water quality combined, VSP, surfboard, Hussman and Aaliyah. Okay, thanks. Well, in this case, we did start with the water quality focus. We included this project in a larger WIRA 37 request to Department of Ecology. And because we're a nonprofit, we are only eligible for 319 funds through that combined cycle and not for Centennial. And we used the funds from DOE to assess the potential for enhancement here. We had a technical advisory group that helped select our preferred approach. And then we did propose it to Surfboard, but we were not successful in that grant round. We followed up with a proposal to the McNary Mitigation Fund, which is administered by the Northern Wasco County PUD. And we were successful in getting support there, support through the Hussman Fund, and support through Voluntary Stewardship Program. And those three grants they were just a little tricky to fit together. The VSP funding expired June 30th, and the Hussman funding started July 1st. And I think the in-water work window started like June 20th or something. So we had a narrow window of time to work those things together. The VSP funding, of course, had to go directly to the landowner, and we held the other two grants. So we had to split the construction and planting contract between the two of us. Moving forward, we're focused on monitoring and replanting, and we're supporting that with the Yakima Basin Integrated Fund grant sources. And then we're hoping to eventually conserve the land through an easement or acquisition, and we don't have funding identified for that. So there's the overview again, and I just want to highlight that this is one of the sites included in a currently funded ALEA grant we have, because we are able to bring students to do field trips and to do volunteer work here. And our biggest challenge here is working cooperatively with a very active beaver who's trying to do their own management of the riparian area. And sometimes our goals are at odds. Second project is up in Ellensburg now. This is a project where we wanted to increase the flow in a side channel of the Yakima River that also provides irrigation. And we replaced 2 gated culverts with a bridge to allow the side channel to get scoured in the spring and hopefully maintain flow later in the season. When we thought about how to support this project, we again looked at the land ownership, salmon habitat, and water quality impacts. This project's on a city park and an irrigation canal. It's critical habitat for listed species and can improve temperature conditions in a downstream creek. So if you'll humor me again, can you put your ideas in the chat on how you might fund a project like this? Okay, so RCO, ALEA. At some point, people are going to start memorizing my chart, but yeah, this project was primarily supported by Surfboard, but it was on the funding cusp and was awarded less funding than we needed for the full budget. NRCS made up that budget gap by making funding available directly to one of the producers who was part of the irrigation company. And US Fish and Wildlife Service awarded the project partners funds. But despite this, what we thought was a robust budget, our first bid process was a fail, and we needed to rescope the project. When we scaled the project down, the elements that would have been funded by NRCS were removed, and so our budget scaled down along with the project. Redesigning the project required a lot more engineering and a lot more meetings, and we quickly exceeded our A&E cap for the Surfboard grant. So it was fantastic to have Fish and Wildlife Service funds to let us move forward, but that A&E cap applies to match as well, and so we were still in a bind for how to demonstrate our match. But here's where that new no-rise analysis requirement turned out to be somewhat helpful. Robes Parish with US Fish and Wildlife Service donated a lot of US Fish and Wildlife Service time into that no-rise analysis. And because permitting is a construction cost for RCO, that match saved our budget. We had to move quickly to make the grant timing work out together, but we have more time from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to adaptively manage the area over the next few years. And so far, go ahead for the next one, Heather. Thanks. We're seeing a lot more water in this channel, so I'm excited to see what happens. The Mercer Creek project is just a few miles north of this in the urbanizing portion of Ellensburg. And this was a real rare opportunity to protect one of our urban creeks before there are houses falling in on its banks. But Ellensburg is full of underground stream sections, so there are no salmon in this northern reach of the creek. The project is on private land, and we were able to coordinate with multiple landowners to make it impactful with a water quality focus. But because there were no salmon, this is not a place where we could bring Surfboard or U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or McNary to bear on the project. And it was difficult to find the grants we needed to make the project budget whole. We applied for 319 in 2020 and were successful, and then applied for a second 319 to make the budget complete, and were successful with that as well. We also secured spills protection funding from DOE, which is critical for the match. And then we're relying heavily on partner match from Kittitas County. And the reliance on that match drove the timing and the feasibility of the project. We're counting on, I think, $30,000 of donated dump truck time. But when it was finally time to move the soil off site, that's when we had the giant snowstorm in January, and the county dump trucks were really busy. So our need to use that resource, because we needed to demonstrate the match, ended up dictating the timing of the project. And then next slide. But we made it through, and the trees are leafing up, and we're excited to see how it functions in this first season. So the final project to highlight is one of our older projects now. In 2008, the Washington RC&D and the city of Ellensburg started to develop this multi-benefit levee setback project near the mouth of Mercer Creek, again in Ellensburg. And Mid-Columbia took over sponsorship of the project in 2009. This is a really important area for salmon rearing habitat, but it was not considered a very high priority at that time. The land is owned by the city of Ellensburg, and we were successful in really highlighting the water quality and the stormwater flood protection benefits of this project, almost more so than the salmon benefits at that time. So I won't ask you to guess, but we did have a considerable amount of funding from Surfboard, 2 different DOE grants. The Washington RC&D was holding one 319 grant, and then the Kittitas County Water Purveyors was holding a second. And then we also had funding that was focused on the flood protection, funding direct from the Yakima Nation for salmon recovery, ALEA funding, once again, lots and lots of volunteer support, and some direct funding from the city of Ellensburg through their stormwater utility. This was a lot to patch together, as you might think. Can you go to the next slide, Heather? Thank you. Oh, and also it appears that we had fuzzier cameras back in 2011. I apologize for that. What we discovered was that the grantors really needed strong assurance that there would not be anything that was billed to 2 grants for the same item. So we needed to spatially segregate our funds for Department of Ecology. Can you go 2 slides ahead, Heather? And we actually found a line on the map that we were able to submit with our billing request saying, this money is from the north, this money is from the south. This is also the project where we realized that match can really be a challenge. We were so excited about all these matching funds that our Surfboard grant had demonstrated something like 40% match. Well, of course, that means that with every invoice, you needed to show 40% match, and we didn't have it yet. So we were able to get approval from RCO to defer the match requirement, which was critical, or the project wouldn't have moved forward. This project is really fun to go visit at this point. It's been embraced by the community for multiple uses. All that money from all those different places really was appropriate because it's a multi-benefit project. So finally, some challenges I'd love people's thoughts on are, how do we support landowners who want to enhance habitat but don't meet required buffer widths for grant sources? How do we work in the headwaters where we don't have salmon, we don't have water quality impairment, but we know we're improving conditions downstream? Match, sigh. The RFEGs have recently issued a request to the state funding agencies to consider removing the local sponsor match requirement, because in so many cases, it's just a significant hindrance to project implementation. And then other considerations are stewardship. The surfboard stewardship grants are critical for allowing projects to really be successful. And A&E, we need to acknowledge that it takes money to manage projects, and that has to be supported by our grants. Thank you.